At the beginning, I must confess that while reflecting on the topic, I have changed my focus a little bit in this paper compared to the abstract that some of you may have read. I will not discuss the relationship between human rights and SDGs and the consequences for education. I will rather concentrate on the last part of my abstract, namely on the question of how spiritual aspects and perspectives can enhance education for sustainable development, ESD, as well as human rights education, HRE. And I will put this question in the context of a prominent and long-going discussion about the role of human rights in pluralistic societies. In usual philosophical, political, or juridical theories, human rights, and I think you can extend that to the SDGs, are viewed as normative frameworks that function like a compass or a guardrail. They are assigned the task of providing a frame within which people can freely live their diverse and often conflictual concepts of a good life. The underlying assumption, of course, is that this normative framework, the values and the principles of human rights, are enough as a fundamental consensus that guarantees peace and social coherence in liberal, pluralistic, and democratic societies. Yet two questions can be raised and have been raised against this view. One is the question of whether the human rights, and recently the SDGs, are as neutral to concepts of a good life as some scholars think. I will not deal with this question in this paper, but rather concentrate on the second question that can be raised, and that is whether frameworks such as the human rights or the SDGs are sufficient to effectively address the big global and societal challenges that we face. So in the following, I will introduce three exemplary approaches that address this question, and that, as you will see, show references to spirituality. So this is my overview. You've just heard the introduction, and then I will present three of these approaches under the topic, the search for the deep spiritual dimension of humanity in philosophical and sociological discourse. And finally, I will try to wrap that up in perspectives from public theology and public religious pedagogy. And in the short time that I thought I would have, didn't know that I would have more time now, but in the short time I would have had, I will only mention very shortly the first two concepts and then expand a little bit more on the third concept. So the first one, Michael Sandel, don't be afraid of the idea of the good life. That's actually a quotation from one interview that was led with him. For 4 decades now, Harvard professor of philosophy Michael Sandel has made it his mission to uphold social and human values against the mainstream of political liberalism and largely unbridled capitalism. His basic thesis is simple. Most major social and global conflicts cannot be resolved on the basis of general rational arguments or ideologically neutral principles of law or justice, but require the inclusion of strong moral and religious convictions. This is firstly because the moral and religious convictions, are important to people in certain life issues. And secondly, because they often offer helpful sources and normative orientation for dealing with social challenges. On topics such as the use of genetic engineering and digital technologies, as well as on fundamental issues of a just and democratic society, Sandel has spoken out clearly against technical perfectionism, capitalist consumerism, and the principle of meritocracy, instead taking a stand for social and human values. And in a remarkable panel discussion in Harvard's digital video studio with 60 young people from 30 countries around the world, he discussed the fundamental philosophical questions raised by climate change. Starting with a specific question, should the rich world pay for climate change? The discussion ultimately led to the questions of what human solidarity actually means in global terms, and how our relationship to nature and material prosperity can be rethought. Second example. An extraordinary publication appeared in 2014. It was produced within the research and consultation project of a British think tank, the Royal Society of Arts. They investigated the question of what spirituality can contribute to overcoming current political and social challenges. Quotation from the text: "Our inquiry was motivated by the fact that while survey data is not clear, many, if not most people, appear to self-identify as being in some way spiritual, without quite knowing what that means. Moreover, many seem to recognize that the world's major problems have spiritual elements that are not adequately acknowledged or addressed, partly because we don't seem to know how to conduct the debate at that kind of fundamental level." Rosen sees the core of spirituality in its deep existential and transformative power. Spirituality, he emphasizes, is not just a lifestyle or making everyday life a little nicer with candles in the bathroom and so on, but it implies a completely different way of living. For Rosen, spirituality is the most important bridge between personal and social change. And this is precisely where its public and political significance lies. Another quote: "We need the spiritual to play a greater role in the public realm because it highlights the importance of connecting personal and social and political transformation. The overarching societal role of spirituality, however, is to serve as a counterweight to the hegemony of instrumental and utilitarian views. At an economic level, this means intelligently critiquing the fetishization of economic growth and global competition. At a political level, it means that citizens need to be the subjects of social change, not just its objects, with spiritual perspectives playing a key role in shaping and expressing the roots and values of democratic culture." My third example, Hartmut Rosa. Hartmut Rosa is professor of sociology at the University of Jena and director of the renowned Max Weber College at the University of Erfurt. In his book Resonance, published in 2016, and translated in many languages meanwhile. The English translation was published in 2021. He develops what he calls a sociology of the good life. A sociology of the good life as a positive counter concept to the undesirable developments in our modern Western societies that he has identified in previous publications, among others in his habilitation book on acceleration. These negative, undesirable developments include the idea, typical of modernity, that a successful life is primarily or even exclusively about increasing resources and options. Increasing resources and options. This idea of escalation and acceleration ultimately leads to an alienated and aggressive, unhealthy relationship to the world. As a result, people ultimately close themselves off from the world. They close themselves off from other people and do not experience the resonance that actually makes life alive and worth living. By contrast, a resonance-oriented relationship to the world is characterized by the fact that one allows oneself to be touched by phenomena or to be called by the voice of another, to interact with it and thereby experience both self-efficacy and transformation. I am changed, something new emerges. This resonance, Rosa emphasizes, is uncontrollable, non-disposable, not feasible, not predictable. This is precisely what makes it so alive. Rosa has repeatedly used the experience of snowfall or of music as examples of this. And increasingly, in the course of his reflections, also the example of religion. For most people, entering a church stimulates a different experience of the world than, for example, entering a supermarket or the workplace. It kind of interrupts everyday life and leads you into a mode of listening and perceiving. It allows us to become open to the experience of something non-disposable, to become open to resonance. Rosa spells out this understanding of resonance in the various basic relationships between people and the world. First of all, it is about ourselves, the relationship to ourselves, in particular to our body, which modern people often see in a kind of self-alienation merely as a resource, an instrument, or an object of design. Resonance has also to do with the resonance spheres of interpersonal relationships, family, friendship, and politics. It has to do with our relationship with the material, everyday world. In the book, he has sections about work, school, sport, consumption. And it has to do with what he calls the vertical resonant axis. The vertical resonant axis. In these, people enter into a relationship with the world as a whole. And therefore, religion is located here as a resonance sphere, but also what he calls the voice of nature, the power of art, or the mantle of history. Rosa sees the essential core of religion in the idea of an accommodating, responding world. God is, as it were, the expression and subject of a vertical promise of resonance. A vertical promise of resonance. Quote, there is someone who hears you, who understands you, and who can find ways and means to reach out to you and respond to you. For Rosa, prayer becomes the ideal expression of a deep resonance, namely an equally listening and responding speech that is directed inwards and outwards and at the same time connects all resonant axes with each other. And, also typical of resonance, is aware of the uncontrollable, non-disposable character of the divine counterpart, God. In Rosa's reflections on the voice of nature, he points out that in romantic thought, listen to yourself and listen to nature have become two complementary imperatives that can merge into one attitude and one action. In terms of resonance theory, the deeper cause of the environmental crisis can then be seen in the fact that modern thinking, in contrast to other cultures, denies all non-human entities the quality of resonance and strictly distinguishes between an animated culture and a mute nature. An animated culture that is responsive and a mute nature that is not capable of resonance, of responsiveness. There is one quotation that wraps that up very nicely, I think. From a resonance theory perspective, the silencing of nature within us and outside us, its reduction to what is available, to what is at our disposal, and what is still to be made available is the actual cultural environmental problem of late modern societies. However, environmental sociology and environmental policy, and even more so the natural science-oriented disciplines, lack the conceptual means to grasp and articulate the emerging resonance catastrophe. They therefore continue to interpret the ecological crisis as a crisis of dwindling resources and disastrous causal chains of effects. So they do not grasp what the core actually is, really is. This should suffice to introduce the central motives of Hartmut Rosa's extraordinarily multifaceted work. Even if the term spirituality does not appear in his book, there are obvious references. If spirituality is often defined in recent psychological literature as connectedness with oneself, connectedness with others, and connectedness with nature and with the transcendent, then Rosa's theory of resonance can be read as a veritable theory of spirituality. And it would be interesting to discuss with him why he doesn't use the word. He might have his reasons. I come to my third part, my last part, perspectives from public theology and public religious pedagogy. Very briefly, perspectives from public theology. Despite all the differences between the three approaches presented, one commonality should have become clear. All three are concerned with what I call the search for the deep dimension of humanity in and behind the current global crisis. According to the conviction of the authors presented, dealing with the ecological crisis in particular requires dealing with the deeper questions of what constitutes our humanity and, consequently, what constitutes a good life, which can also be understood as a spiritual question. These assessments coincide with the basic lines of recent Christian theological contributions on the topic, such as the encyclical Laudato Si by Pope Francis and similar Protestant statements. And if there was more time, I would have expanded on that a little bit, but there is not more time. But my basic thesis is, at this stage, public spirituality should be a major subject matter of public theology. And also because it is very necessary to distinguish, of course, between problematic forms of spirituality and positive, humane forms of spirituality. Second, perspectives from public religious pedagogy. The fear of the idea of the good life, diagnosed by Michael Sandel for pluralistic modern societies, also seems to apply to parts of public education in Germany and I think also in other Western countries. There seems to be a certain normative abstinence in school education and a focus on pragmatic and functional aims of education. However, this kind of normative restraint in schools, and especially also in school-related educational sciences, is in blatant contradiction to the major challenges that are seen as current urgent tasks for schools. Democracy education and human rights education, racism and anti-Semitism prevention, peace education, digital education and AI, as well as education for sustainable development. In the international context, as early as 2001, the American-Israeli educational philosopher and Jewish rabbi Hanan Alexander called for the discovery of the spiritual and the question of the good life for public education in his book with the programmatic title Reclaiming Goodness, Education and the Spiritual Quest. You can find the book on the book table. A rediscovery of the deeper spiritual dimensions of education is particularly obvious in the German context because the German concept of Bildung, from its tradition and to this day, is centrally and primarily aimed at the self and world relationship of the student as a self-educating subject. It is therefore only logical that the German expanded version of the presented volume Spiritualize by Rosen contains a separate section on Bildung with the German word, in which the proximity between Bildung and spiritual sensitivity is emphasized. And it is also in this line that Hartmut Rosa's book on resonance not only contains a separate chapter on school as a resonance space, but that he has also published a resonance pedagogy together with the educationalist Wolfgang Emdes in 2016, in which he develops education in terms of resonance theory as world relationship education. World relationship education. So in my view, these are promising pathways for human rights education and for education for sustainable development to explore and to build on. Thanks very much for your attention.